Diplomacy in a Dangerous World is made possible by the following. The CPA firm of Katz, Sapper & Miller, committed to providing owners of Indiana companies with advice on complex tax matters for over 70 years. Katz, Sapper & Miller, our people, your success. More at ksmcpa.com.
Well, that would be the easiest applause I've ever had in my life. I want to welcome you. My name is Rob Manuel. I'm the president of the University of Indianapolis, and I want to welcome you tonight to the conversation with Senator Lugar and Senator Nunn. I'm excited to see so many of you here tonight. We've been dreaming up this conversation for at least the past 4 or 5 months, and to see it come to reality is a true, terrific opportunity. So thank you for coming down to the university and being part of it. In 2013, we welcomed Senator Lugar back as a member of our faculty at the University of Indianapolis. We invited him back to lecture and to mentor students here on our campus, and also through our Lugar Academy, which houses students in Washington, D.C. I use the phrase welcome back because after he left the Indianapolis mayor's office in 1976, he taught political science here before winning his Senate seat. In fact, I'm told that he watched the returns to that Senate election in the basement of the President's house, where I now reside. Well, it's always nice to have a senator engaging your students in the classroom. It was the nature of this particular senator, a thoughtful scholar, willing to seek common ground on difficult issues, that motivated us to ask him back to be part of our community. Senator Sam Nunn also embodies those qualities, and in fact, the two men are here tonight because of the landmark work they did while on opposite sides of the political aisle, putting aside differences to address one of the most pressing issues of our time. We seek to connect the characteristics that have defined them and their work to the developing aspirations we have in forming our 5,500 students and in serving our larger community in which we reside. These values of service, civility, humility, which are trademarks for all three people who will soon join the stage in a minute, are also at the heart of our university's development plan, our university's $50 million development plan, which will benefit the university, our students, and also the community in which we live. Our new initiatives there were chosen carefully because they show benefit to our community, provide ways to increase the quality of life on the south side of Indianapolis, and strengthen our commitment to educating students who are skilled in their own discipline and prepared to use their talents to benefit others in the world. I'm grateful tonight to Steve Inskeep for serving as our moderator. I'd also like to express my thanks to our sponsor for this evening, Katz, Sapper & Miller. And lastly, I'm thankful for the leadership of Lloyd Wright in Indianapolis, the president of WFYI, for agreeing to be a partner with us in tonight's event, but also for the role he plays in our larger Indianapolis community. As we seek to showcase lives of meaning for our students, I'm proud to share the stage tonight with Lloyd and put him and WFYI up as models for our students. So to welcome you on behalf of WFYI and to introduce our moderator for this evening, I'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Lloyd Wright. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks, President Manuel. We are so delighted to be here this evening and extend our longstanding partnership with the University of Indianapolis, and especially honored to collaborate this evening with the reception that we had earlier in the program featuring two of the most accomplished United States senators and international policy experts, certainly of our time. As Indiana's flagship PBS and NPR stations, WFYI Public Media is committed to amplifying the voices of our community in a variety of different ways. We do that through our award-winning public television and radio programming and multimedia services, our many, many opportunities in education and lifelong learning, and our unique ability to convene the community and to have conversations and encourage civic engagement like the conversation that we're about to experience here tonight. Diplomacy in a Dangerous World. And wanted to note that we are capturing this evening's conversation as part of a live webcast, And you can also see it on WFYI TV 20.1 on Thursday evening, February 27th. That's at 9 p.m. And it'll be on WFYI 90.1 FM radio on Friday evening at 7 p.m. And I just wanted to mention that we have such a wonderful, long-standing relationship with the University of Indianapolis. It was a thrill for us to meet in Esch Hall earlier tonight. Some of you may know that Dr. Eileen Esch was the founding chair of the board of directors that launched public television in Indianapolis. That goes back to 1965. And for nearly 44 years, since we signed on the air in 1970, WFYI Public Media has been enhancing the lives of Central Indiana citizens with commercial-free programs and educational services. And in fact, WFYI's humble beginnings can be traced back to the era when Richard Lugar served as two-term mayor of Indianapolis from 1968 to 1975. It was at that juncture of his political career that then Mayor Lugar served as a tireless advocate for WFYI and its launch in 1970 as Indianapolis' first educational television station. It's as if he knew then the importance of public media, because more than 4 decades ago, Senator Lugar had a keen sense of the understanding of the vital impact of WFYI's educational programs, services, and the future it would have for our community. So we appreciate being associated with Dr. Esch and Senators Lugar. That's why in 2006, we established the Senator Richard Lugar WFYI Public Service Award in recognition of outstanding individual service who demonstrates the sustained support of public media in a similar way that then Mayor Lugar performed. So we're so proud to be here, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight the moderator. I hope that you're very familiar with him, and I hope that you hear him on 90.1 FM weekday mornings from 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. We're so delighted that he's come back home tonight. He brought with him his mother, Judy, and his nephew, Connor Inskeep, are in the crowd tonight. Carmel, Indiana native, Carmel High School graduate, an award-winning journalist, and for 18 years he's been associated with NPR, and amazingly, since 2004, he's been associated with Morning Edition, the most listened to news magazine program of its kind in the country. Since joining Morning Edition in 2004, Steve has hosted the program from New Orleans, Detroit, Karachi, Cairo, and Tehran. In 2006, he was honored with the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for a series of reports that he produced for NPR on the conflict in Nigeria. This evening, we're honored to welcome Steve Inskeep back home to Indianapolis to serve as moderator of tonight's historic conversations with Senators Richard Lugar and Sam Nunn. Let's welcome him home. Steve Inskeep, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Of course.
Good evening, thanks. It's good to be here. Thanks for that very gracious introduction. It's an honor to be on this stage and to share it with the gentleman who will be coming out in a moment. Just to underline how unique and different Senators Nunn and Lugar are, let me just observe one thing. These are gentlemen who are deeply respected for their intellectual ability and their commitment to their country, despite having served a long time in the United States Congress. I mean, you know, you get people who are deeply respected and you get people who serve a long time in Congress, but to get both, really a distinction. And I think that they were understood in their time in the Senate as being different and as embodying one of the greater traditions of legislating in the United States, although I'm sure that both of them would tell you that politics can be difficult and politics can be ugly, and you never get everything you want, but you could sense a higher purpose and a seriousness of purpose. We're going to show a little video that will introduce you to some of the work that they were involved in over the years that feels directly related to the news of today. And after that, we'll bring them out and we'll have a discussion. Let's have a look.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
As the former states of the Soviet Union fell, the world celebrated the end of an era dominated by fear. Yet two men maintained the foresight to see that though the immediate threat had been dissolved, a new peril faced the nation and the world. Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana and Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia proposed a revolutionary idea. With the Soviet Union's economy and infrastructure severely compromised, who was to maintain and protect the tens of thousands of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons now idle? Together, through bipartisan partnership, Lugar and Nunn set out to pass the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. It was a radical piece of legislation which was faced with much skepticism at the time. It proposed to offer funding and expertise to secure and dismantle weapons of mass destruction throughout the former Soviet Union. In November 1991, Lugar and Nunn succeeded in passing what is now considered one of the most successful disarmament programs to date. Over time, the initial aim to secure Soviet nuclear material from Russia, Kazakhstan, and the Ukraine shifted to include other nations like Albania, Iraq, and Libya. Today, the world is free of over 10,000 weapons of mass destruction because of the foresight of the Lugar-Nunn Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. But the work of reducing the world's supply of dangerous weapons and materials continues as new threats appear on the horizon, and the Nunn-Lugar program marches on. Thanks to you both, and I look forward very much to this discussion. I want to begin, if I might, on the news. Many people who are following the news right now are aware of the situation in Ukraine, the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine, we should say. But there's a fact about the fall of that country's President Yanukovych, the revolution in the streets in recent days, that it eluded me until I was thinking about our upcoming discussion. And that is how different that situation might be. Didn't Ukraine, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, have, 1,000 nuclear warheads on its soil? How different would the situation be today if they had 1,000 nuclear warheads today?
Well, it would be very different indeed, but at the time, the Russians were very apprehensive about those weapons. In fairness, the president of Ukraine understood that the weapons were going to be very difficult to service because of all of the ties with Russia, and he was in favor, really, of getting rid of them so there would not be an attack or some difficulty there. The Rada, his legislative group, was not very happy about that. I've mentioned, Sam and I have reminisced about this today, that we went to see Boris Yeltsin, and he told us in no uncertain terms when we went to see Kravchuk, the president, to tell him with unprintable words what was going to happen to him if he didn't give up the weapons and what have you.
Unprintable words.
Yes. Heavy translation, I think.
Oh, okay.
Making a long story short, we did see him, and I made a proposal at the table that we think about $150 million we would work with him to get rid of his weapons. He jerked Sam and me out, press conference with two reporters, one radio, one print, and said Senator Lugar has just offered Ukraine $175 million for our weapons. And Sam was always a good sport about this, but still he wondered what in the devil has gotten into.
You were offering it
Yes.
to move the weapons, not to buy the weapons.
Well, to work to destroy the weapons.
All right.
So then Kravchuk came back and said to the press, Senator Lugar has just offered Ukraine $175 million for our weapons and what have you. So to make a long story short, why I came to see President Bush, and he was very sad over his election defeat to President Clinton.
This was 1992.
Yeah, but a good sport about this. He wrote a letter to Kravchuk, $175 million. And so as a result, this started. It went on for a while, but every single one of those weapons came. A lot of the material went to Russia. A lot came finally to the United States in the form of the uranium that came out of that, which we've been using for electricity in the United States for a long time. but it made a huge difference, to make your point.
Was this the scenario, that what we're seeing now, a scenario that was in your heads at the time, that you would not want to have a country that turns out to be quite unstable with a large nuclear arsenal like this?
I'd say absolutely true. Dick Lugar, he had a great advantage over me. I was a legislator. I'd been in the Georgia legislature and the Senate. He'd been mayor, so he was accustomed to writing checks and making commitments. Every time I've been with him on a trip since then, and there have been many of them, I've always asked him if he has his checkbook, because, but nevertheless, it made a lot of difference. But I don't think we would have gotten this far with Ukraine keeping those weapons, because, as Dick said, the Russians were adamant that they were not going to allow that. In fact, I was in a meeting, I think we were both together, when we met with the military leadership, the chairman of the Russian military forces, and I was convinced walking out of that meeting that they had contingency plans that they were very serious about if Ukraine did not give up those weapons.
Oh, meaning the Russians were going to go after them?
Oh, I think they would have gone after them, and I don't know what would have occurred then, but I do not think we would have gotten to this point. But had we gotten to this point with the present situation, the instability, or even before this point, because there's been a tremendous economic instability in Ukraine for a number of years, you multiply the dangers we have now by many times in terms of having those nuclear weapons. It was the third, I believe, the third largest arsenal in the world, more than China, more than Britain, and more than France. I believe that's correct. But Dick mentioned something, and in this whole area, there's so much to be concerned about. Occasionally, we have to look at the bright side of things, and he mentioned the purchase of the highly enriched uranium that were in those weapons. Mm-hmm. That was the Ukrainians' demand, that they wanted their part of the value in the weapons on that soil. So you take the highly enriched uranium, which is what makes atomic explosions occur, you blend it down into low enriched uranium, and you blend that into fuel, and you burn it in nuclear power plants, and the United States purchased that under agreement with Russia, because the weapons were taken to Russia, and it was a three-way cooperation. And so we've been buying that material. The program's been going on for almost 20 years now. It's about to run out. And basically, if you look at the electricity in the United States, 20% of it is nuclear. 50% of the fuel being burned for the last 20 years has been from that source. So 10% of all the electricity in the United States for the last 20 years has come from weapon material
nuclear weapons
that was aimed at us during the Cold War. So I consider that a parable of hope when you've got all the other problems that we sometimes wring our hands about.
I want to ask a little bit more about the history of this, but just to ask you to comment on the situation in Ukraine right now. You've both visited the country. Senator Lugar, you know the man who was the president until a few minutes ago, Yanukovych. I think Americans look at this news story and just don't understand what's going on. Do you feel you understand what is happening in Ukraine right now?
Yes, I think I do. I think essentially Ukraine is in a situation of near bankruptcy. Now, the European community made overtures, and perhaps Ukraine was interested in moving toward Europe and out of the orbit of control or difficulties with Russia in this union that Russia wants to have. But the European Union really would have called for great austerity, as it has for European countries. The Ukrainian people already felt pretty drained. Yanukovych, I suspect, felt this was just not going to sell domestically. He would really have problems. And Vladimir Putin came along and said, how about $15 billion of aid?
Ukraine's leaning between Europe and the West, and the two sides are bidding.
And so he went that direction. Now, at that point, of course, the Europeans are very unhappy. The United States is anxious about this, to say the least. But I think the point is that this was beginning to bring about in one half of Ukraine, which is more oriented to Europe, a real sense of rebellion. The crowds got larger and larger and larger. For a while, Yanukovych did not have people firing and shooting at people. Occasionally somebody got killed, overstepped. But nevertheless, we finally came to a point here in which he feared maybe that they were going to overthrow him, that he personally was going to be in jeopardy. he already had been repudiated by the Russians, who felt that he was making too many overtures to the West, and they held up the $3 billion that was going to be sort of the first down payment of this. And the world was absorbed in the Olympics, in essence. But when the firing occurred and 80 people were killed and so forth,
in the last
this went over the top. And as a result, the police, for a variety of reasons, abandoned the president. Everybody abandoned the president. He couldn't even fly out of the country, out of Donetsk. And we don't know where he is at this point. This is a situation, as we've already said, it would be fraught with disaster if he had nuclear weapons. But it's a potential disaster in any event because of the bankruptcy. They really are headed for the rocks. And so the Europeans and the United States might decide to come forward with $35 billion, is what they claim they're going to need to stay alive. This really hasn't been brought up to anybody in the Congress that I know of, quite apart from the Europeans, who were not thinking of $35 billion either.
You're not thinking that Congress would be that eager to bail out a foreign country?
But it's in a situation in which no one wants to make any overtures until there is a government in Ukraine. It won't be until Thursday, we understand. Somebody may emerge at that point. And at least it's a democratic situation. The parliament is making the decision. The parliament has representatives of all sides in it at this point. So it's conceivable they may have a government. Now, at that point, hopefully the United States will move diplomatically as well as the Europeans together and make a difference. Because I think Vladimir Putin suspects that we won't, and that ultimately he's finally going to get his way, that this union with Ukraine, 40 million people, which is basic, really, for his future in Russia, because Russia has huge economic problems, too. They need Ukraine down the trail, if not immediately. So all of this is floating around, and the headlines day by day will record different things, and that's why you hesitate to predict.
If only the Ukrainians had more nuclear weapons to sell, they could deal with their economic problems.
Even uranium, yeah, highly enriched.
Do anything you want to do.
Steve, somehow in this, I agree with Senator Lugar's analysis completely, but somehow in this we've got to create a win-win situation. Russia sees this as a win-lose situation. And European community and Russia have been going back and forth on the whole aid package and so forth. We really need the European aid. America needs to pitch in, and Russia needs to pitch in. This is a situation where if Putin makes the wrong moves, if he basically tries to encourage economically or otherwise, certainly hopefully not militarily, but if he tries to encourage a split up of Ukraine, it's going to be a disaster for Russia, a disaster for Ukraine, and a disaster for Europe, and a very dangerous situation that will go on for years.
And there is no speculation about this.
The Crimea is the section of the Ukraine that is the southern section. The Russians have their Black Sea Fleet there. It's a huge emotional and military and security issue. So we're going to see in the next few months whether we're going to have this as a source of tension for many decades to come. This is not going to be one of those things that's over immediately. And if we do not have the kind of leadership that we must have, and I believe I'm encouraged from what I'm seeing so far from both Europe and from the United States, not so far from Russia, but if we don't understand that this is one of those things where everybody can lose or everybody can win, but only by working together.
Any idea what a win-win situation would look like? It seems from the outside the country leans toward Russia, leans toward Europe.
Keeping the country, the sovereignty and the integrity is the main thing right now, not letting it split up. And not having the people that are Russian ethnically feel that if the other group takes over, they basically are going to be discriminated against. The Ukrainian parliament that just took over, from our perspective, they're certainly better than the crowd that just went out, which were pretty awful. But they just, in my view, made the first mistake is basically saying that no Russian language. And that would be non-official.
And let's remind people this is an ethnically divided country.
This goes back. Russia was basically started in Ukraine. So we're going to have to understand a little bit about the history here and the culture here and try to do the very best thing we can do in terms of helping Ukraine, but also preserving the territorial integrity and probably having some very quiet and very firm discussion with the Russians about the implications if they do encourage a split up, and I hope they do not.
Well, let me build on that phrase, win-win situation, and ask you a little bit about the history. Because both of your names are on a piece of legislation that was passed in the aftermath of the Cold War that we saw described in the video, that, if I may summarize very briefly, proposed to spend American money to help secure the nuclear weapons and other weapons of the former Soviet Union. First, where did that idea come from? Second, what made you think it was a vital thing, a good idea?
I don't want to take too long here, but let me give you a little bit of history, and some of the students here in this audience might appreciate this. I was 24 years old, going to Washington right out of law school at Emory University, working for the House Armed Services Committee, was invited to go on a NATO trip to Europe with the U.S. Air Force with a bunch of much older staff people from the Senate and House. Long story short, this was October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in Wiesbaden, Germany at Ramstein Air Force Base right at the peak of the crisis, sitting by the Air Force General who would have been the first one to release his aircraft, which were one-way mission aircraft stationed right there at the base. They would have nuclear weapons. They didn't have enough range to come back, so they would all bail out after delivering their weapons. So they were going to be the first one struck because the Russians, the Soviets knew that was the first ones that were going to hit them. So it dawned on me at age 24 that the world was very close to a Holocaust, something unimaginable. And from that point on, of course, the crisis subsided about the time I left Germany. And Khrushchev backed down and Kennedy made some moves and so forth. But nevertheless, it occurred to me that the world had come very close. And that if I ever had a chance in my life to do something about those dangers, I was going to try to do it. Then flash forward to 1974, I'm in the United States Senate. I'm asked by Senator Stennis, who was chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He'd been shot on his back porch and wasn't traveling. It was a random burglary. Nevertheless, I was asked to go to NATO and come back and make a report to the Senate. I went, I spent hundreds of hours preparing for it, and I basically concluded that American military forces, NATO military forces, were not sufficient in the conventional sense. We relied far too much on not only nuclear weapons, but the early use of battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, where they were stationed very close to the frontier, and if there had been an invasion by the Warsaw Pact, we were going to either use them or have to back them up on the same highways that our dependents were being evacuated. Totally unworkable military situation. And when you talk to the military people at night, you know, not in a formal setting, they would tell you pretty quickly they were going to ask, the day there was any kind of confrontation, they were going to ask for a nuclear release from the president. Because they had calculated it was going to take the White House 4 or 5 days to make that kind of
nuclear release meaning give us permission to fire when ready.
Give us permission even before we need them, because it was a lag time there. This was an extremely dangerous situation. I got off the airplane, this didn't come out publicly for many years, went directly to see Jim Schlesinger, who was Secretary of Defense, and told him how dangerous I thought the situation was. In addition to that, our military forces were demoralized after Vietnam. We had alcoholism, we had drug problems, and so forth. And I visited tactical nuclear weapon bases where there were really, the security was to say the least, very alarming. And all of that I went back and reported. I spent a lot of my career in the Senate working on strengthening America's conventional capabilities so we'd be less reliant on nuclear weapons. And then flash forward one more time to 1991. I'm in Budapest, Hungary. I'm invited by a Russian friend right after Gorbachev was taken prisoner and he was released. He asked me to come to Russia. I went to Russia. Long story short, it was very apparent the empire, Soviet empire, was coming apart. And it was also very apparent that even their military forces were very alarmed about having nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons spread all over the 10, 11 time zones. So that's when I came back to Washington, recruited Dick Lugar. We had all sorts of hell break loose in terms of people opposing it on both sides of the aisle. But Dick Lugar was so respected, the two of us worked together, and that's how Nunn-Lugar came about. We had to actually take a provision out of the authorization bill because I was chairman of the committee, and I'd put a provision that became sort of like Nunn-Lugar in the conference report but it had not passed the Senate. It was already in conference, and then people legitimately claimed it had not passed the Senate, so you can't put it. Anyway, I got Dick Lugar to help, and from that point on, we had meeting after meeting with our colleagues for about 2 months, and what had been violently opposed by the Senate in September of 1991 was passed in December of 1991. And this man's a remarkable leader, so I give him huge credit.
Why did people oppose it?
Well, let me just make a quick comment about that, because Sam and I were invited by President Reagan to go to Geneva, Switzerland in 1986, when it looked as if arms control talks with Russia might begin. And the president knew you needed a bipartisan 2/3 majority to pass a treaty, so he was wise enough to invite people like this. I had great respect for Sam at that point. I did not know him as well as I was going to very shortly, but we were both in that delegation. Nothing happened that year, sadly enough, but we continued to go to Russia, sometimes together, sometimes separately, during the subsequent years. And it sort of jumped to the conclusion. We came to a meeting one day in Sam's office that I remember very vividly. He has a round table in the office. When he left the Senate, I asked him to roll it down to my office. And now I've rolled it out to the Lugar Center, where is this, because it was such a significant conversation. Here were Russians that we had met informally. During those 5 years, they were giving us the word. Things were breaking apart. Things were getting worse. They were confidential. We weren't friends, but they wanted to share it with somebody, I guess. But this time they came, and this is a very rough translation of what they said. In essence, you Americans must know that the security is breaking down around the nuclear weapons that are aimed at you. It may very well be that people could come onto those bases and do some terrible things. It might be simply they will steal a little bit of nuclear material or whatever it can pick up because they're desperate. Our troops are not getting paid, and that's why they're deserting. That's why they're leaving. Now, this is a pretty awesome thought, that all of these weapons that we've been talking about, the thousands, are aimed at us, every American city, every...
How many, 6,000 nuclear weapons? Was that a rough number?
Well, I don't know. 6,000 was to start one treaty, or the news, but...
It was thousands
it was
anyway.
10 or 11,000 probably.
10 or 11,000.
Yeah, warheads. But in any event, in essence, Sam and I said, what do you want? And they said, we're going to need a lot of your money. Money.
There's a common theme developing in this discussion.
Well, they were bankrupt, and secondly, however, we're going to need your personnel, experts who know really how to bring about security, how to begin to take apart this business, to work with us. This is where the cooperative threat reduction sort of arises. Third, they said, you know, we might even need your troops. We hope it won't come to that. And we said, well, we hope so too. Now, that didn't settle it all, but I think Sam had already been working on this issue. I was grateful to be invited into the picture, and we did have a breakfast. Ash Carter, who just left the Pentagon as #2 guy, came with a white paper and talked about what we might be able to do. That wasn't all encompassed in the Nunn-Lugar initiative, which was an amendment to some appropriation bill passed in about the last 2 days of the '91 session. And the problem then was that the administration, in fairness, President Bush and others said, well, you know, senators don't do this sort of thing. You can't negotiate with the Russians. You can't start carrying on. I'm the president. Foreign policy is the State Department, all about it. So Sam and I then took a delegation, including General Burns, father of Bill Burns, who's still in the State Department, and others, over to Russia. And we went to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus on that occasion. We all got religion together. We saw the security problem. We saw what was going to need to happen. But that didn't loosen things up at all. And as Sam says, in the Senate, there were a good number of people, a good many of them in my party, who sent out a dime for the Russians. What in the world are you thinking about? why again be involved at all with these people?
Foreign aid
Yeah.
and foreign aid for the enemy.
Now, I had just one final thought, because this really does jump ahead. I was in a silo in Ukraine, and this was where a big missile had been pulled out of. You had an elevator, went down to the 13th floor, and this is where the guards had been. And on the walls around the table where the guards stood watch and so forth were pictures, beautiful pictures of American cities. And these were identified as the targets. Now, I thought, you know, all the time I was mayor of Indianapolis, we were sitting here from 68 to 75, we were targeted. We could have been obliterated. You know, this is why this is a very meaningful program in my mind. Thank goodness we weren't. But, you know, the fact was I was oblivious of all of this throughout that period of time. So were most Americans. They could see the military side, but they didn't realize that there were enough warheads to knock out all of our major cities, plus the military installations. This was because all, and that was called mutually assured destruction. Now, we thought we had about the same amount of warheads to send over there if they ever dared to do that. And they knew that. So it was a standoff for 40 years. But we were mighty fortunate as a world, quite apart from the city, to make it through to that point where we could finally then talk to these Russians around Sam's table. And they wanted our money and our people in a cooperative threat reduction. And then convince the administration that we were not all bad guys, that really they ought to be on that same side likewise.
You mentioned that this important piece of legislation, which must rank as one of the more important things that was passed that year, one of the more lasting things that was passed that year, was shoehorned onto an appropriations bill?
Yes.
So you stuck it onto some bill that had to pass anyway.
It was a $400 million appropriation to be utilized by the president for the purposes that we were discussing here, at his discretion. Now, it was $500 million, as a matter of fact, but in the conference, as I recall, Senator Byrd, who was then the majority leader of the Senate, cut it down to $400 million. And so that made it through. That was the first part of it.
What does it say about Congress and how it works that you would take something that important and that's the way you would have to get it passed? Not by debating it straight up precisely, but by figuring out a way to attach it to something else that had to pass?
Oh, we debated it. The people have certainly expressed their views on the Senate floor, their opposition to it. But as a technical matter, we were not going to be able to pass a clean bill just dealing with Nunn-Lugar and nothing else. That was out of the question at that point, with the Senate ready to adjourn. And so in a parliamentary way, this was the way to get the job done.
So explain to people how the $400 million was spent. Where did it go?
Well, actually, the one reason that was one of the reasons it was so important that it worked is because we didn't give them cash. We basically had work accomplished that got paid for once the work was accomplished. And a lot of contractors came from U.S., the West, so it was not simply taking cash and putting it in the pockets of the Russians. At that stage, that would not have worked. But when you look at the chemical destruction, for instance, and it still has carryovers right now, with all the tragedy in Syria, and it's still going on, one of the bright spots, at least potentially, is the fact U.S. and Russia have now agreed to help get rid of all the Syrian chemical weapons, the whole stockpile. Well, guess what? The experience working together in destroying chemical weapons between the U.S. and Russia came because we helped them destroy their chemical weapons.
So this would be American experts with Russian experts,
right.
Russian manpower.
And then the lab-to-lab relationship between people who actually know how to build nuclear weapons. That came out under the Department of Energy kind of part of the Nunn-Lugar program. Enormously important. Building trust with former adversaries is a long-term proposition. We still see it. You can't Crane right now, one of the biggest problems of distrust between the Russians, Europeans, and the United States. This building trust took place under Nunn-Lugar from lab to lab, from military to military, from chemical expert to chemical expert. The equipment is now being used in Syria, is going to be used if we ever get the Syrian government to comply, has come out of the Nunn-Lugar experience, the Nunn-Lugar program. Dick Lugar, after I had left the Senate, expanded this program beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union and expanded it to cover situations like Syria and like Libya and like Albania, right?
Yes.
And so he did that, and it had a remarkable vision. That wasn't easy to pass either, I'm sure, because when you think about it, I mean, it was remarkable we passed it at all because, you know, 40 years of the Cold War, there was absolutely no trust and no sympathy. But we made the argument, which was absolutely true, that this was not an aid program. This was a security program for the United States and for the world. And it was. It still is.
You mentioned several things worth following up on, first having to do with trust between the United States and the Russians. This is a moment when U.S. relations with the current Russian government seem fairly bad, on a fairly high level. Is that trust still there on a lower level? Is that infrastructure of trust, if I can call it that?
Individual to individual, but not institution to institutions. We work better with the Russian military on the nuclear part than we ever did on the biological. We work well on the chemical and on the nuclear, but the biological is still a big problem. And in my view, in the future, the biological threat will be just as serious as the nuclear threat, and it combines with Mother Nature on infectious disease. So sometimes you don't know the difference between a deliberate attack and an infectious disease. So we've got a long way to go in working with Russians. They developed some terrible biological weapons during the Cold War period. They basically found a way to weaponize smallpox. And these things are horrible. As hard as it is, and it is hard, we've got to work together with Russia. We've got to build that trust. I've spent, and Dick Lugar's my boss here, he's on our board, but we've spent the last 2.5 years working on a project called Building Mutual Security, where, without going into all the details, we are proposing that Europe, NATO, Russia, Euro-Atlantic community sit down and start having military-to-military discussions on all these security issues. So we begin to take off the table the distrust. And one of the cardinal principles that came out of my 1974 trip to NATO was we need more warning time. All leaders need more warning time in a nuclear age, particularly true when you add cyber to it. One of the things that I do not believe we will have a deliberate nuclear war between the United States and Russia. I do believe we still have a possibility of an accidental war. I think we have a possibility of an escalation of coming out of something nobody intended. But that's got to be dealt with on a politically mandated. It would have to be the presidents of the countries in charge, mandating the military people not to sit down and negotiate a treaty. That takes sometimes years, but to begin to put all their concerns and apprehensions on the table. Wouldn't just be U.S. and Russia. It would also be Russia vis-a-vis the Baltic countries, where there's huge distrust with the Russians. East Europeans, huge distrust of the Russians. So this is needed, not just U.S. Russia, not just NATO Russia, but all of the countries in the Euro-Atlantic community. It would take years. This is a decades project, but building trust after 40 years of the Cold War is not going to happen quickly.
I need to talk about trust just for a second.
Go ahead, Senator.
Because I went over to Russia in summer of 2012, really to rescue the Nunn-Lugar umbrella agreement. This is what gave us the right to have people going all over Russia, keeping track of the weapons and so forth. The Russian War Office didn't want any part of it. The Foreign Office wanted to negotiate. To make a long story short, it expired in 2013, and thus our ability. But two things happened while I was there. I went out to Surovatica, a place where we had been financing the destruction of missiles. We had a luncheon out there. A Russian senator came out. He wanted to be a part of this. For the Surovatica people, it was a jobs issue. They wanted Nunn-Lugar to continue. They wanted to continue to destroy these missiles, quite apart from what central government might do, which is very interesting. There was a press conference held there, and very clearly this was sort of expressed. When I came back, Michael McFaul, who's now going to leave Russia, was our ambassador, working very hard under very tough circumstances. We met with a lot of Russians. We had very good conversations. And because of this, I had a press conference in which I suggested, because we had worked with the Russians out at Sucha, that Sam and I had visited a long time ago and seen chemical weapons out there. They were bituminizing them, they called it. They were taking all of the bad stuff out of the weapons and then burying it, in essence. And a huge project as they moved toward no chemical weapons. we put all that up together, most of it with American money, as a matter of fact. I suggested in this press conference attended by the New York Times, plus Reuters, international press, and the Russians, of course, that we had had great experience working together on chemical weapons. And it'd be a good idea if the two of us got our military people together and thought, because we have respect for each other, we would gather up the Syrian weapons and destroy them. Well, no one said no. No one said yes. It was sort of a pause for everybody.
This is exactly when? This is last year?
It was in August of 2012.
In 2012.
So, in any event, make a long story short, this year, when the proposal happened, Russian television came to my office there in Washington with the network. They wanted to do a half-hour show. And they said, Lugar, are you happy finally your idea was accepted? Well, I said, well, that's very flattering. My impression was that President Putin really suggested all of this. Give full credit.
Or Secretary of State John Kerry accidentally suggested
it,
or
may
accidentally on purpose suggested it.
A lot of people suggested
depending on.
But nevertheless, it makes the point about cooperation and not exactly trust, but there's still a pragmatic feeling that there's a relationship here. The problem is getting enough people back and forth to Russia to talk about it, to have the communication with their press, with their people out in the hustings, with Russian senators, with lots of other people. And that's not occurring in the same way because under the New START treaty, we have 18 inspections a year. And I'm told by our Defense Department people, this is inadequate really to keep track. There are allegations from time to time of cheating on treaties and so forth. This is going to continue until we really get a better flow once again. The Nunn-Lugar program offered Sam and me an opportunity to go and see Russians. And we saw them in Geneva or elsewhere in Europe or in Russia, and others we took with us. Very important, I believe, if we're going to have some cement here.
You alluded to a kind of backstory that I hadn't heard about how it came to pass that the world agreed to remove chemical weapons from Syria in the past year, an effort that is moving very slowly but seems perhaps to be moving. And that raises just another question for me. There are experts who are trying to do that. Is there expertise that was developed under Nunn-Lugar that's being used, or even individuals who worked on that program?
You bet. All of it has been. And it's by DTRA, DTRA, a Defense Threat Reduction Agency in our Pentagon. At the time when the Syrian thing arose, they pointed out they've gotten machinery that can go out in the field. It's portable. They can destroy most of those weapons. Now, as it turns out, the weapons are supposed to come out of Syria. Only 11% have thus far. The Syrians are trying to delay it for 2 months and so forth, to a ship. And DTRA will destroy it out there. But it's American technology. It's remarkable. And we have the ability to do this and to do it very thoroughly.
Steve, the other thing that people don't realize is that we have made progress on chemical destruction. And that's awesome, huge stockpiles of chemicals by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Senator Lugar and I have visited this place called Susha twice. You've been 3 times, I think, but I've been out there twice. You put on gas masks. There are 1,990,000 artillery tubes full of gas, sarin gas.
Like warehouses full of?
Yeah, and you go into warehouses and you put on gas masks. You go in there and there are holes in the roof. They're in a very low area they were then that was sinking gradually. They had a time clock ticking of how long the supplies could stay there. So America went out there and helped, with other countries helped too, and they built railroads and they built destruction plants, and they've now about finished getting rid of that. We had Ash Carter, you mentioned Ash Carter, who just got out of the Pentagon, terrific guy. Ash basically calculated that when you looked at the chemicals at that one location, there was enough chemicals there, if properly disseminated, and that's impossible. You can't disseminate chemicals efficiently. That's the reason they didn't work in World War I. But if they did, theoretically, there were enough chemicals there to kill everybody on the face of the earth 3 times over in that one site.
You made a remark, Senator Nunn, that may have been cryptic to some people, and I want to explain what you're talking about. You mentioned Senator Lugar being on a board. I'll say that Senator Nunn was talking about the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is an NGO, a nonprofit if I'm not mistaken, that continues working on these issues. And since you said Senator Lugar's on your board, I presume that means Senator Lugar is still writing the checks for this relationship, if that is correct, or raising the checks.
No, actually, he's authorizing me to write them now.
Oh, okay, fine. It's good that you've, come up in the world in that way. One of the things I was interested to learn talking with you earlier is that you have a specific ranking of threats around the world, which leads us to the next part of our discussion. What scares you? What countries scare you? What situations scare you?
Well, I think if you look at countries right now, I think Pakistan has already got nuclear weapons. They are basically a country that has a lot of economic problems and challenges, so that's one of the real danger spots. Of course, Iran, if they get nuclear weapons, that changes the whole Middle East and much of the world. That's a very dangerous situation. North Korea has already got nuclear weapons. That's very dangerous. But I think if you look broader, I think it's the fact that we have a new threat environment and we haven't quite realized it, we being the world, not just the United States. When you look back in history, and the Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft, Nathan Myhrvold, recently wrote an article on this. I think it was in the Council on Foreign Relations magazine. But nevertheless, he said that if you look back at all of history, every new weapon has had to take more and more resources, more and more money, more and more state involvement. But that part of history is now behind us. We've got weapons of mass destruction that can be produced by people that have a certain element of knowledge for much less funding. And it's not a monopoly of states anymore. And that's true with chemicals, it's true with biological, it's true with radiological. Building a nuclear weapon would certainly not be a piece of cake. But if you get nuclear materials, that can be done. A crude weapon can be built. So for the first time in history, we don't have state monopoly on weapons of mass destruction and disruption. You add in cyber, where disruption can take place in major destructive ways by a 17-year-old kid sitting in a basement somewhere. And you can attribute that to some other country when it may be somebody right here and doing it. So attribution is a huge problem. So we're in a new threat environment. In many ways, it's much better than it was because we don't have the chances of, in my view, of a deliberate war between the United States and the Soviet Union now. That was a huge thing leaning over us. But we're in a new era, and we haven't quite realized that yet. So it's going to change a lot of things. And it also means to me that countries have more incentive to work together than ever before. That may be the bright side of this if you're looking at the bright side. Because I see it, we're in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. It's true with Russia, U.S., it's true with Europe, Russia, it's true with China, U.S. We can't solve the North Korean problem without working with China. We're not going to solve the Iranian problem without working with Iran. We're not going to be able to solve the Ukrainian problem without working with Russia. So we really are indeed in a race between cooperation and catastrophe, as I see it.
Senator Lugar, what scares you?
The fact that this terror can be created by, if not individuals, by very small groups. As Sam has pointed out, no longer necessarily nation states. For example, just to use a personal case, the worst anthrax attack in the United States arguably occurred in an office 2 floors above mine in the Hart Building. Senator Daschle's staff opened up envelopes. Anthrax spores flew out, came up into the ventilation system of the place. We were ushered out of the office and told we were not ever going to return. Went over to the Dirksen building, our throats swabbed, told to take Cipro tablets for 48 hours or we might die. Now, this is an interesting experience to wait for 48 hours, sort of see what's going to happen.
Take some Cipro and call me if you're still able in the morning.
But it was not melodramatic because some people in the post office died. Now, we never have known exactly where this came from. This wasn't necessarily Russians or it wasn't anybody in particular. Never resolved. Sam has talked about cybersecurity, cyber attacks. Thank goodness much of this we are involved in as a country and have had some situations that came exposed in Iran where we tied up some things. But this is a whole new situation. We've been thinking about visible things like nuclear or chemical or biological. But now we're in an age in which it's conceivable that large portions of our economy or our hospitals or whatever could be shut down. People could be suffering in horrible condition without ever knowing exactly where it came from and who in fact is doing this sort of thing, who to retaliate against for that matter. This is something that we're really not on top of as a country. We haven't really had the debates we need to have. A lot of people still discussing privacy and what's happening here. But I just raised this not to be difficult in the conversation, but to say that this is another form of terrorism, but it could be a whole societal problem, quite apart from just an attack on the Hart Building.
I want to give a couple of questions before we wrap up this discussion to members of the audience. People here, some of them were invited to submit questions, and I have a couple of questions here from students here at the University of Indianapolis that I think help very well to round out our discussion. The first is from Brandon White. This is a provocative question, gentlemen, but it builds on some things you said. You alluded to the difficulty of preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and what a difficult situation that could be. Mr. White takes a very different approach to that question and says it's generally accepted that two states with nuclear weapons are less likely to engage in conflict because of mutually assured destruction, which you mentioned, Senator Lugar. And so he goes on to say, Israel is the only country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons. Wouldn't a nuclear Iran provided the much-needed balance in the region?
I think we were during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States, and France and, of course, Britain had nuclear weapons, so did China. But we were all very prudent and very cautious, and I think also very lucky. There's a new book out now about how many times we came close to nuclear war. And of course, I mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there were accidental things that happened that could have gone off into a war. And you've got the case just about 4 years ago, U.S. Air Force plane took off from South Dakota, flew to Barksdale, Louisiana, did not know they had 6 nuclear weapons on board. Plane wasn't authorized to have nuclear weapons. The pilots didn't know it was on board. The people at the base didn't know they were missing. People in Barksdale didn't know they'd arrived. So you've got situations like that, God forbid, you have 10, 12, 14 countries with nuclear weapons. It would defy all odds if we could go another 50 years with those kind of scenarios and not have an absolute disaster. If you start having a catastrophic, even a very crude weapon that killed 100, 200,000 people, you've changed the whole economic framework of the world. You've shaken the confidence of the world. If a terrorist group got a nuclear weapon and blew up one part of one city, and they would claim they had others, they would claim they had them, they would try to blackmail, they might have others. It is really, to say that we're going to be safer if Iran gets nuclear weapons defies every bit of common sense I know of. I think the world's going to be much more dangerous. They won't be the only ones. If they get them, they're not going to be, Shiite weapon over there.
Oh, the Saudis may want a nuclear weapon, you're saying.
Perhaps Turkey, perhaps Jordan, perhaps several other countries.
Senator Lugar?
Well, from the standpoint of Israel, it's an existential problem as they see it, and we've been very sympathetic with that outside look at it. I would just say that Israel is in a situation, given the Middle East, the Arab Spring illustrates this in many ways, the continuation in Syria of Sunni Shiite conflict with other parties coming into it, in which the spread of nuclear weapons in that area does really, because of maybe religious passion of people, lead to potential for nuclear conflict. So my own view is that it's not a question of giving Israel a pass on the question. It's simply that they do have the ability to defend themselves. This is recognized, and one reason why perhaps they will continue as a sovereign state, and this is why I'm supportive of that.
But Steve, one thing to keep in mind, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968. It was basically a deal between the nuclear powers and the countries that did not have weapons. And the deal, using my words, not trying to quote the treaty was the deal was the nuclear countries would step by step get rid of their nuclear weapons. That was the deal. In exchange, the countries that didn't have nuclear weapons would not obtain those weapons. That was the deal that's largely held together. You've got exceptions now that are a huge problem. Iran and North Korea we've talked about. But under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, South Korea gave up a nuclear program. Taiwan gave up a nuclear program. South Africa gave up a nuclear crude capability. We've had 3 countries. One of the great things about the Nunn-Lugar program, we had 3 countries that got rid of all their nuclear weapons. We talked about it, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Huge arsenals, they've given them up. So this is not hopeless, this is not bleak. But we have to keep making steady progress. The countries that don't have nuclear weapons have to be convinced that the countries that do have them, including Israel, are going to step by step find ways to get rid of them. Now that is difficult, it's very tough. George Shultz and Bill Perry and Henry Kissinger and I have written several articles in the Wall Street Journal. We call it the vision and the steps. And basically it shows a commitment. It says we ought to have a commitment to carry out our obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but these are the steps that are going to be required to get there. And of course we've talked about some of them: controlling nuclear materials, verification, enforcement, comprehensive test ban where people don't test, therefore they couldn't have confidence in their weapons or less confidence. So there are all sorts of things we've got to do. But we've got to keep marching forward with both the vision and the steps and both parts of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's a huge loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the same technology which every country feels they're entitled to, that can make low-enriched uranium, which would be legitimately used nuclear power fuel. That same technology can take it all the way up to 80–90% enrichment. And that's where they've gone to 20%. We've got to find a way to deal with that loophole. In my view, in the long run, we've got to find a way, though it will be difficult, to take every country that is doing development of plutonium, reprocessing the plutonium, or enriching uranium, even low enrichment, under camera. We got to have it under supervision.
Last question, very briefly. You've told me what you'd like to work toward. Tell me the end state, because Christine Burns, a student here at the University of Indianapolis, asks, what is the ideal scenario with regards to ownership of nuclear weapons worldwide? Who should have them? Who should not? Will they ever be completely eliminated?
I hope so. I don't know that that will happen. It may not certainly happen in the next few years. There's so many steps that have to be taken, including the ones I just enumerated. But our best hope is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which basically has a parallel obligation on countries that have them to get rid of them. We signed up to that. Every president has supported that. And the countries that don't have weapons not to develop them.
Senator Lugar, I'll give you the last
There will
one.
need to come a point in which we are on a very, very different framework with the Russians in particular. And I would say that is not impossible. It's not foreseeable right now. But there could be leadership there with the 2 largest nuclear powers, working then with our European allies, the Russians with others. People will say, well, what about Pakistan? What about India? Who takes care of North Korea? And so forth. Lots of problems. But I think there could come about in this world the feeling that nuclear weapons are so horrible that they really are a menace to civilization as we become closer and closer communication-wise or travel-wise or what have you. And Sam said the NPT treaty does offer an avenue for that to occur. It's not a totally original idea, but it's going to call for a great deal more human contact and perhaps changes in governments and circumstances that are very different than ones we see now.
Okay. Folks, please join me in thanking the university, WFYI, and these 2 senators. Please stand, gentlemen. Richard Lugar and Sam Nunn.
Thank you. We made it.
Diplomacy in a Dangerous World is made possible by the following. The CPA firm of Katz, Sapper & Miller, committed to providing owners of Indiana companies with advice on complex tax matters for over 70 years. Katz, Sapper & Miller, our people, your success. More at ksmcpa.com.